So this video follows on from the Ghosts of the Tower of London Part 3, which I released just a couple of days ago, which covered some stories from the infamous Tower of London, including that of the executed World War II spy Josef Jakobs, and also covered the interrogation, torture and death of Anne Askew. If you haven't already watched that video, you might want to go back and have a little look at that video first. Also, if you are a subscriber, can I ask that you please check to see that you are currently subscribed? There seems to be a bit of a problem of people becoming unsubscribed and not receiving the notifications. And I think this seems to be happening across many channels, not just my channel. So if you're new, welcome, and I hope you consider subscribing. If you've been with me for a while, please can I ask you to check those settings, because I'm a little bit concerned that people are not receiving those notifications. So shortly I'm going to talk about an incident that happened to me at the Tower of London. It's the only incident that I really can't explain. I'll talk about that in a moment, but just before I do, I wanted to say thank you to the viewers from my previous videos who were kind enough to leave some very interesting comments about their time on duty at the Tower, as well as places like Windsor Castle. Or they've shared the experiences of other people that they know who have spent time stationed at the Tower. And I'm always grateful for your wonderful comments, and I thought I'd share a few of them with you here. And I wanted to particularly thank Alan, who wrote the following. When I was a police officer involved with security searching at the Tower of London ahead of royal visits, our dog handlers told me they couldn't get the explosive sniffer dogs to enter the White Tower. Well, Alan, I thought this was really interesting because they say, don't they, that animals are able to sense a lot of things that perhaps humans can't, especially things of a paranormal nature, perhaps. Lots of stories you hear, don't you, of animals reacting in a really uncharacteristic way, perhaps when something's not right, or they've sensed something, or seen something that we can't maybe hear or see. And I always think how experienced and rigorously trained those dogs are to work with those amazing handlers. The relationship is really quite extraordinary. So for them to behave so out of turn is very interesting. I'd love to hear from dog handlers who've experienced anything like that, whether it's Tower of London or anywhere else for that matter. What is it that makes that well-trained dog suddenly not want to continue to do what it's been trained to do? Disgruntled of SW6 wrote a comment, and he said, I have spent a considerable amount of time on guard at the Tower of London, especially during the first lockdown in 2020. I can personally testify that many weird and unexplainable occurrences took place. Well, Disgruntled, thank you for taking the time to comment. I'm completely intrigued. I really want to hear more. Perhaps if you're willing, you could share some of your experiences. You can always email or leave them in the comments box, but I know that quite a few viewers said, you've got to tell us more, Disgruntled, we want to hear more. And I'm one of those people. Louise commented, my father was stationed at the Tower of London in the late 1940s. He said it was the scariest place on earth. This was before the sodium lights of modern times, and London was a much quieter place than today. Thank you so much, Louise. I would imagine it would have been terrifying back then too. I think the darkness, the lighting, and I would imagine there probably would have been lots of coal pollution in the air, would probably have made it even darker again, I suppose. You probably would barely be able to see your hand in front of your face, perhaps, sometimes. I think even just the looming historic structures of the tower, even in daylight, they can be quite formidable, quite intimidating. I think they would be far too much for me to cope with. I certainly wouldn't be good as a yeoman warder, I'll tell you that right now. I could probably do a job in a gift shop maybe, but I'm not going to get a job in that one in the basement in the White Tower. No way. And just one more story before I tell you about the slightly odd event that happened to me at the Tower. This story is from Lance Harding, and I love this story so much. He writes, my uncle was a yeoman warder all through the 1970s until he retired. He told me the only ghostly experience he had in all the years he lived and worked there was one night his wife Auntie Janet woke him up. He went to the Tower grounds, where he met a soldier with a fixed bayonet. He said to the soldier, what is going on? We don't know, sir. Something is going on in the White Tower. When they got to the White Tower, they heard chanting, looked in the window, and saw a ring of monks wearing habits, with the hoods up in a circle, walking and chanting. Uncle Den said, "Give me the key, I'll get those buggers out of there." When he put the key in the door and unlocked it, when the door was opened, it was all in darkness, where previously the lights were on, and they had just disappeared. Well, Lance, I just love this story. I don't know where to begin. I have heard stories of choirs being heard in several locations in the tower. I haven't really heard anything about monks per se, but given its age and, its history, I'm sure it's entirely possible. So it's a really interesting story that it must have been witnessed maybe by several guards there. Very odd indeed, but fascinating. I especially like the old-fashioned attitude of your Uncle Den, sort of, give me the keys, I'll get it sorted out. It reminds me of the steely determination of those sort of characters from the 1970s, programmes like The Sweeney and that sort of thing. It reminds me also of a lot of my family on my dad's side, my dad's brothers. They would have all had a similar attitude to that, give me the keys. I love it. So thank you for sharing that story with us. It was great. So I just wanted to share with you an incident. I think the best thing to call it is an incident that happened to me in July 2007 at the White Tower. Well, actually, it was on the wooden steps outside of the White Tower, the main steps that the visitors go through. They go up the steps and turn right, and then you're in the White Tower. So I was there, and it was a really warm, hot July day. Not terribly hot, but it was not breezy. It was pretty stifling. And the tower was pretty busy. It wasn't ridiculously busy. I've seen queues at the Tower of London that were, huge. But I did have to queue to get into the White Tower on the steps there. But it was not a big deal because the queue was moving fairly quickly. And it was fine, It's a pretty well organised place, to be honest. So I was at the top of the steps on the very last step before you go onto the flat bit, which is right next to the door there. There were 4 people in front of me. There was a man nearest the door, and then he had his 2 daughters, and then there was a woman in front of me, who I'm assuming is the mum, and I stayed on the step, even though there was plenty of room on the flat bit, because I'm the sort of person who thinks, well, they're a family, just give them a bit of space. There's no rush, there's no need to push. We're all going to get in, it's fine. And then there was a member of staff on the door who I think was clicking people in to the building so they knew how many people were in the building at that time. So I'm stood on the step on the left-hand side. I'm leaning on the rail on the left-hand side. I've got a family of 4 people in front of me. The tower is on my right, and the door is also on my right. And I'm stood there and I'm looking out and I'm thinking nothing at all. It was just stood on the steps. And this is really difficult to describe. I'm going to do my best. In just a matter of moments, maybe less than a second, someone had walked into the outside of my right shoulder fairly firmly. And I thought, how bloody rude. Who's that? Who's done this? And I turned and I started looking, and there was nobody there. And I looked in front of me at the people, the family that I was talking about, and they were all looking around as though to say, what the hell was that? The lady in front of me had a blue handbag on her right shoulder with a thin leather strap. And whatever this thing was that had knocked her right shoulder, it had knocked the bag off her shoulder and she'd managed to catch it in the crease of her elbow. And I thought, who's pushed past me? And the best way to describe it is that it was like a slightly clumsy child ascending the steps maybe 2 at a time, not quite looking where they're going and not realising that they're kind of invading people's space. Does that make sense? I hope that. It was very, very strange because had it been like a paramedic or an emergency person coming through, I'm sure we would have heard them say, excuse me, can you move out of the way, please? But there was nothing. The person behind me also felt this knock to the shoulder. And I remember the lady in front of me, when her bag fell off her shoulder, she turned and looked at me. Maybe she thought that I could have been involved with it, but I wasn't. How can I put it? It's It just felt like a person. It did not feel like the wind. I'll tell you that right now. There's a big difference between a person brushing past you. There was no heat. There was no coldness. There was no wind. My hair didn't move or my coat, I didn't feel any whistling in my ear. But it was like somebody walked past me at speed, knocked into me a little bit, and then went on. And this is the bit that I find particularly strange. That family in front of me, they all felt it. The dad was convinced that he had heard footsteps on the flat bit at the top of the stairs. Now, I didn't hear any footprints or hear footsteps. Neither did I feel the step that I was on buckle as though the weight of somebody else is on it, if that makes sense. So whatever this was moved quickly. And he turned and he said, he said to his wife, "Did you feel that?" And she said, "Yeah." And he looked at the girls and said, Did you feel that? And they said, "Yes." And he turned to the person on the door and he said, "What was that?" And the woman on the door said, "Oh, don't worry, that happens all the time." And I just looked completely puzzled. I had no explanation as to what it was. It was very odd. I've been back to the tower many, many times since then, and I've never experienced anything, and I've been in the White Tower lots of times, but nothing. So this is the sort of slightly weird bit, as the dad was going into the tower with his kids, he turned to the kids and he wiggled his fingers and he went, "Ooh, spooky," like that, And I'm not joking, this guy, he was white as a sheet. I think he was really freaked out. And he struck me as just a normal chat with his family. He was white as a sheet. And then moments afterwards, we were allowed to go into the tower. And I said to the lady on the door, "What is that then?" She said, "We don't know. It happens all the time." And all I could think as I went into the White Tower at that moment was, whatever that was, it's probably in here with us now. And I was really freaked out. I was quite scared, actually. I found myself latching on to other groups that are going around the White Tower there, because I was a bit I kept looking around thinking, any minute now some kind of person's going to emerge. It was really quite nerve-wracking, and I think I found the exit to the tower pretty quickly. But that is the only time. I don't know how to explain it. I've got no explanation for it as such, but that's what happened, and that's all I can tell you. It sounds like it's happened to other people, doesn't it, from what the lady there said? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. So I just want to briefly go back to the story of the German spy Josef Jakobs, who I talked about in Ghosts of the Tower of London Part 3. And just want to talk about him for a little bit, because I found out quite a lot about him, and there's quite a lot of mystery surrounding him and his death and everything that he is. And then I'll talk a bit about the chair and why that's my favourite exhibit at the tower. So in researching this story, I found several different sources, and I noticed that some of them contradict each other. So I really wanted to have a look at this. And I do think there is a case that some texts can be quite melodramatic. They want the narrative to fit a certain format. For example, German spy found injured in a field, arrested by our good boys in the Home Guard, locked up in the Tower of London for a vicious interrogation and then executed and buried in the tower in an unmarked grave. But it seems the reality is far from this. So we do know that when Jakobs was captured, he was initially taken to Cannon Row Police Station, which is in Whitehall, and despite his broken ankle, he was medically assessed and declared fit to be interrogated. And MI5 found him to be malleable for double-cross work, which I think effectively meant the death penalty. And then he was transferred to Brixton Prison Infirmary so that his ankle could be treated. So the nature of his injury in his ankle was so bad that he was moved on to Dulwich Community Hospital, and he was held in camera, which is a legal term meaning in private. So he moved around to several locations in London and the surrounding areas, including Latchmere House, Wellington Barracks and possibly the Tower of London, although I think it seems quite unlikely. He certainly stayed at Wandsworth Prison, which I'll talk about in a moment. Some sources say that he spent time imprisoned at the Tower in the Waterloo Barracks in cells near the clock. Perhaps those are the same cells as the Krays were held in. Some say that he was stayed and was treated at the Tower of London Hospital. We know that he received a prescription from the hospital on the 14th of August. That was the day before he died. And maybe that's why some people think that he stayed at the Tower on his last night. I've been asking the curators at the Tower to see if they can explain to me a little bit more about whether or not Jakobs spent any time at the Tower itself. Then he spent his final few weeks and nights at Wandsworth Prison, it seems. The records at the prison show that cells F2 and F3 were definitely military cells at that time, and Jakobs was brought to F3 on the 23rd of July, and from what I gather, F3 is the location of the chaplain today. And just around the corner from F3, very close to Jakobs' cell, in the E-wing, was the execution chamber for the hangings at the prison. And on the 5th of August 1941, Jakobs was condemned to death. And the following day, 2 German spies were hanged at Wandsworth at 9 a.m. And they were hanged by Thomas Pierpoint and his nephew Albert Pierpoint, who I think many of us have heard of. And during the Second World War, Albert Pierpoint hanged 15 German spies and also US servicemen found guilty of capital crimes in England. And it's likely that Jakobs would have been able to see the bodies of the deceased be removed from the gallows at Wandsworth. The Treachery Act of 1940 was brought in to facilitate the prosecution and execution of enemy spies, and between 1940 and 1946, 19 people were executed under the Act, and many were hanged at Wandsworth. And Jakobs was classed as an enemy combatant, and therefore he faced the firing squad, so it was a little bit different for him. He was helped by the chaplain to write to King George VI on the 8th of August, asking for an appeal, but because of the nature of his conviction, it was more of a plea for mercy, and it was rejected. And if you want to see the text of the letter that he wrote to King George VI, really asking for anything to be done to save this problem, this incident that he's facing, then I've put a link to the text in the description box below the video. So very early on the morning of the 15th of August, the governor of Wandsworth Prison, whose name was Major B.D. Grew, wrote in the Daily Prison Journal that he'd seen Jakobs leaving the prison at 4:40 a.m. And then years later, in 1958, the same governor wrote a memoir, and he wrote in it that Josef Jakobs spent his last night at Wandsworth before being taken to the Tower to face the firing squad. As dawn came, I stood at the entrance to my office as he approached, still limping from his injury, British military policemen escorting him. I watched him go down the steps and into a military police car with its outrider escort alongside, and escort cars in front and behind. As the massive doors of Wandsworth Prison swung slowly open, the coming dawn was lighting the field at the front and touching the trees and barrage balloons with its cold light. The procession of cars, with its central figure, passed quickly through the gateway into the deserted streets on its way to the Tower. As you know, Jakobs was executed by firing squad at the miniature rifle range, and apparently the nickname for this building was the Sinister Shed, and it was located between the Martin Tower and the Constable Tower. And if you look at this map, you can see on the right-hand side a white rectangle just on the right of the Fusiliers Museum. And it seems that this is where the rifle range was, and it was pulled down in the late 1960s, and is now the location of an outdoor covered carport for yeoman warders to keep their vehicles. The 8 soldiers from the holding battalion of the Scots Guards were armed with Lee Enfield rifles, and the squad fired in unison at 7:12 a.m. on a silent signal by Lieutenant Colonel C.R. Gerard. After the execution, Jakobs' body was taken a very short distance to the Tower Bridge mortuary. I didn't even know there was a mortuary in the Tower Bridge. And this mortuary is incorporated into the North Pier section of the bridge and is sometimes referred to as Dead Man's Hole. And there's a sign on the gate that reads, "This site was formerly used to retrieve the many corpses that were thrown into the river from the Tower and surrounding districts. They were stored in the mortuary below these steps until removed for burial." and the coroner, whose name was W.R.H. Heddy, pronounced death being due to the passage of bullets through the heart. It seems one of the bullets had hit Jakobs in the heart directly, and 4 had been in the vicinity of the target, suggesting that 3 of the soldiers could have been given blanks, and his body was taken to St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery, where he was buried in an unmarked grave in a common plot. Interestingly, the white target that was attached to Jakobs's chest seemed to disappear. Nobody was quite sure what happened to it. And then in the 1970s, the editor of a magazine named After the Battle did some detective work, and it seems they found it on display at the Scots Guards Museum, which is at the Wellington Barracks on Birdcage Walk, and it had a little sign attached to it, which you can see in front of you now. So you've got the little circle there with the sort of holes in it. But we've got another mystery, because apparently the guardsman who's mentioned in that little plaque, Guardsman C.V.T. Gordon, later a lieutenant colonel in another regiment, well, he was a member of the Scots Guard in World War I, but he wasn't in World War II. He was part of the South Staffordshire Regiment in World War II. So I think the authenticity of this target is quite questionable. Maybe I need to contact Wellington Barracks and see if they can give us some more information. I just think it's a really intriguing story, and one that seems to be surrounded in mystery, and I think it's unlikely that Jakobs was held at the tower for any length of time. Perhaps the tower will give me some answers, and if they do, then I'll update this video and put some details in the description box below. Just before I finish, I just want to come back to that chair that's on display at the tower. And if you were to sort of put 3 things in front of me from the Tower of London collection, for example, a sceptre, Henry VIII's armour, and the chair that Jakobs was executed on, I think I'd go for the chair every time. I don't know why, I find it absolutely extraordinary. I've seen it many times now, and it always gives me the chills, never fails. And I don't know, my gran had chairs just like this when we were kids. They were a really common sight for us when we were growing up. We used to do our homework at the table there. I used to do my colouring in there. She used to put the racing post out on the table and ask us to choose horses and send us down the bookies with 10p or whatever it was. So this sounds a bit strange, but that's what it was like when we were kids. And so this chair and table just seems like something from my grand's house. But it's not that, it's the fact that this chair is where somebody had their final moments. And to know that your death is imminent as you sit on that chair, I just find it very, very interesting. And I think about what must have gone through Jakobs's mind at that moment, to have that wooden back press, that sort of loop at the top of the chair, digging into your shoulders, and have your hands tied around your back, around those spindles. You probably would have felt the sides of the back of the chair digging into your forearms, I suppose, there. And then to feel the guards prepare those restraints and put a black hood on you, and someone attaches a target to your chest and you know you've got seconds to go. To see the chair in the flesh, even though you're seeing it through the glass, it's really very powerful. It's very, very moving. And I'm not sure I would have had the bravery to ask the firing squad, or the Tommies, as is mentioned in the texts, to shoot straight. I'm assuming he must have said that from the far end of the firing range. I mean, would they even have heard him? I don't think you get to meet your executioners generally before you go into the firing, the rifle range there, although Carl Lodi apparently was escorted with his firing squad to the miniature rifle range. That was in the First World War, though. And the sheer force and destruction on the top of that chair in what must have been a split second, I can only imagine. The power from those rifles, it must have been immense. When you see the wood and the way it's broken like that, it's quite extraordinary. I often think, would those people living in the casemates right opposite have heard those rifles? I would imagine that they probably would. And I think, you're looking at a first-hand relic this broken relic of a very, very dark time in history. And this event wasn't even long ago. It was 1941, less than 100 years ago. It's such a moving exhibit for me personally. I never ever get tired of seeing it. Anyway, I just wanted to share those thoughts with you and say thank you for listening. I have the most amazing subscribers. I have the most wonderful comments to read, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. And if you haven't already, please feel free to like and subscribe and share. And thank you for helping my channel to grow. Thanks, everybody.